Our dream home became a nightmare of escalating hate, forcing us to make a desperate call to the last people we ever expected to save us. We'd finally done it. The two-story house with the oak tree in the front yard, the one Sarah and I had saved for a decade to afford. It was our forever home, the place where our 6-year-old daughter, Lily, would make friends, ride her bike on the sidewalk, and grow up safe. The neighborhood seemed perfect manicured lawns, kids playing in the street, the smell of barbecue on weekends. It was the American dream, or so we thought. We were the only mixed-race family on the block. I'm white, my wife Sarah is black, and our daughter Lily is the most beautiful combination of us both. At first we didn't think anything of it. This was the 21st century, after all. The first crack in our perfect little world appeared the day we moved in. Our next-door neighbor, a man in his late 60s named Mr. Henderson, came over while we were unloading boxes. He had a tight, forced smile that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. He shook my hand but barely glanced at Sarah. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, his voice flat. "Things are changing around here, I see." He looked from Sarah to our house and back again, a flicker of something ugly in his gaze. We brushed it off as him just being an old-fashioned, grumpy guy. We were wrong. It started with small things. Our trash cans would be tipped over on collection day. Dog waste would mysteriously appear on our pristine lawn. We'd get anonymous flyers in our mailbox for white supremacist groups, tucked inside the usual junk mail. We tried to ignore it, to rise above it. We told ourselves it was just one hateful person, that it didn't represent the whole community. Sarah tried to organize a block party, to build bridges, but the RSVPs were few and far between. People were polite to our faces, but distant. We were outsiders. Henderson had poisoned the well before we even had a chance to drink from it. The situation escalated dramatically about a month ago. I came out one morning to get the paper, and my heart dropped into my stomach. Scrawled across our clean, white garage door in jarring, crimson spray paint was a racial slur, big and bold for the whole world to see. Lily saw it before I could cover her eyes. She asked me, "Daddy, what does that word mean?" I've never felt such a potent mix of rage and utter helplessness. We called the police. An officer came, took a report with an air of tired boredom, and told us it was probably just kids. He said there was nothing they could do without a witness. He suggested we install security cameras, as if the burden was on us to protect ourselves from the hate that was being thrown at us. The cameras went up the next day, but it didn't stop them. The psychological warfare continued. Late-night phone calls with nothing but heavy breathing on the other end. Our car tires were slashed twice. Henderson would stand in his yard, just staring at our house, sometimes for an hour at a time. His teenage son Kyle was even worse. He and his friends would ride their bikes past our house, yelling obscenities, making sure Lily could hear them. They were trying to break us, to scare us into leaving the home we had poured our entire lives into. The breaking point came yesterday. Lily was in the front yard, drawing with chalk on the driveway. I was watching her from the living room window. I saw Kyle and 2 of his friends walk up to the edge of our property. My blood ran cold. I was already moving towards the door when Kyle picked up a rock from his own yard. He looked right at Lily, a sneer on his face, and said a word that made my vision go red. "Hey, little mud," he shouted. "This is a white neighborhood. You don't belong here." He then threw the rock. It wasn't aimed directly at her, but it landed just a few feet from where she was sitting, shattering a piece of her chalk art into dust. Lily burst into tears, terrified. That was it. The line had been crossed. This wasn't about property anymore. This was about my daughter's safety. I flew out the door and screamed at them until I was hoarse. They just laughed and ran off. I held my sobbing daughter, and I knew right then that I couldn't handle this alone. The police were useless. Our neighbors were complicit in their silence. We were an island, and the tide of hate was rising. That night, after I put a terrified Lily to bed, I sat in the dark for hours, my mind racing. Who could I possibly turn to? There was only one option left, one I had avoided for over 5 years. It was a call I swore I would never make. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a number I hadn't dialed since our father's funeral, a number belonging to my estranged older brother, Rick. We hadn't spoken because I couldn't stand his lifestyle. He wasn't an accountant or a lawyer. He was the president of the local chapter of the Vipers Motorcycle Club. A man who lived by his own rules, surrounded by men who looked like they chewed nails for breakfast. I hated what he represented. The chaos, the danger. But right now, I wasn't just Mark, the suburban dad. I was a father whose child had a rock thrown at her because of the color of her skin. And I needed help that the law couldn't or wouldn't provide. Swallowing my pride, my fear, and every judgment I ever had about him, I pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice. I almost hung up. Then a low, gravelly voice answered. Yeah? It was him. My voice was barely a whisper. Rick? It's Mark. I need your help. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, so long I thought he'd hung up. I could hear the faint sound of clinking glasses and distant, gruff laughter. He was at the clubhouse. Mark, he finally said, his voice stripped of its earlier casual tone. It was sharper now, focused. What did you say? I took a shaky breath, the dam of my composure finally breaking. I told him everything. The tipped trash cans, the slurs on the garage, the slashed tires, Henderson's constant menacing stare. My voice cracked when I told him about the rock, about the word Kyle had called my little girl. I didn't cry, but the words came out raw and ragged, torn from a place of pure paternal fear. Another silence stretched between us. This one was different. It wasn't empty. It was heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. I could almost picture him, standing in a corner of the noisy clubhouse, his jaw tight, that familiar storm cloud gathering in his eyes. He wasn't my estranged brother anymore. He was Lily's uncle. Where do you live? He asked. His voice was dangerously quiet. I gave him the address, my suburban street name sounding absurd as I said it into the phone. All right, he said, the two syllables carrying the weight of an ironclad promise. Don't do anything. Don't talk to them. Don't even look at them. You understand? Just keep your family inside. We're coming. He hung up before I could even say thank you. I stood in my dark living room, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dead air. What had I done? I'd just called in the cavalry, but my cavalry wore leather vests with a snarling viper patch on the back. Sarah came downstairs, her face etched with worry. Who was that, Mark? She asked, her arms wrapped around herself. I couldn't lie to her. It was Rick, I said, my voice hollow. Her eyes widened in disbelief, then fear. Your brother, Rick. The Vipers. Rick! Mark, no. What were you thinking? We can't fight hate with that. We don't know what they'll do. I didn't have a good answer for her. They threw a rock at our daughter, Sarah, was all I could manage to say. The police did nothing. Our neighbors are watching it happen. I don't know what else to do. I just want them to leave us alone. We didn't sleep that night. We sat together on the couch, watching the security camera feed on my laptop, jumping at every shadow. The next day was a Saturday. The tension in our house was suffocating. Lily could feel it, staying close to us. Her usual bright energy dimmed. Outside, it was business as usual. Kids rode bikes, sprinklers hissed, and Mr. Henderson was out in his yard, meticulously pruning his rose bushes, occasionally glancing over at our house with a smug smirk. He knew he was winning. He knew we were scared. By mid-afternoon, I had started to think Rick wasn't coming. Maybe he'd had second thoughts. Maybe it was just a bluff. A part of me was relieved. Another part was crushed with disappointment. Then I heard it. A low, distant rumble. It wasn't a truck or a plane. It was a deep, guttural thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that didn't belong in our quiet, cookie-cutter world. Sarah and I looked at each other. The sound grew louder, closer, multiplying. It was the sound of rolling thunder on a clear day. I went to the window and pulled back the curtain. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. Turning onto our street wasn't one motorcycle. It was a procession. 10, then 20, then 30 gleaming machines of chrome and steel, their engines roaring in a deafening chorus that shook the very windows of our house. They moved slowly, deliberately, a river of black leather and denim flowing down the pristine asphalt. Doors opened all up and down the block. Neighbors stepped out onto their porches, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. The kids playing street hockey stopped, their game forgotten. Mr. Henderson froze, his pruning shears dangling from his hand, his smug expression melting into one of sheer, unadulterated shock. The bikers didn't slow down. They rode right up to our house and in perfect unison parked along the curb on both sides of the street, effectively blockading our property. The thunderous roar of 30 engines cut out at once, plunging the street into a shocking, profound silence. At the head of the pack, a man swung his leg off a massive custom-built Harley. He was bigger than I remembered, his shoulders broad under a leather vest covered in patches. He pulled off his helmet, revealing the familiar hard-set jaw and intense eyes of my brother. Rick scanned the street, his gaze lingering for a cold moment on Henderson, before finally landing on my window. He gave me a short, almost imperceptible nod. He then turned to the man next to him, a giant of a man with a braided beard, and said something I couldn't hear. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. This was real. I had no idea what was about to happen. Rick started walking, not towards my front door to greet me, but directly across my lawn, his heavy boots leaving imprints in the perfectly manicured grass. He didn't stop until he was standing on the property line, just feet from where Mr. Henderson stood, frozen in place, his face as white as a sheet. Rick just stared at him for a long moment, the silence stretching on, before he finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable threat that echoed across the terrified street. "We need to have a little chat," he said, "about your welcoming committee." Mr. Henderson seemed to shrink under Rick's gaze. The color had completely drained from his face, and the pruning shears slipped from his limp fingers, clattering onto the pavement. He was a bully, but like most bullies, he was a coward at heart. Faced with a man who was not only unintimidated, but was radiating an aura of pure, cold menace, Henderson's lifetime of petty authority crumbled. He stammered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I don't know what you're talking about," he finally managed to squeak out, his eyes darting from Rick to the 24 silent, leather-clad sentinels lining the street. Rick took another slow step forward, his boots crunching on the grass, crossing the invisible line onto Henderson's property. "Don't you," he said, his voice dropping even lower, making it more terrifying. "Let me refresh your memory. We're talking about trash cans. We're talking about spray paint. We're talking about phone calls. And we're talking about throwing rocks at a 6-year-old girl." With each item on the list, Rick's voice grew harder, sharper. Henderson flinched as if he'd been struck. "That wasn't me. That was my boy, Kyle. Just kids being kids," he mumbled, trying to deflect. Rick's head snapped towards Henderson's house. "Get him out here," he commanded. It wasn't a request. Henderson hesitated for a fraction of a second, then scurried towards his front door like a frightened rabbit. A moment later, Kyle emerged, swaggering at first, but his bravado evaporated the instant he saw the scene on his front lawn. His face went pale, his eyes wide with fear. He looked like a cornered animal. Rick didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He just pointed a thick finger at Kyle. "You, come here." Kyle looked at his father, who just gave a weak, terrified shake of his head. The boy shuffled forward, his eyes glued to the ground. Rick waited until Kyle was standing right in front of him. "Look at me," he ordered. Kyle reluctantly raised his gaze. "I'm only going to say this once," Rick began, his voice dangerously calm. "This family," he said, gesturing with his thumb towards our house without taking his eyes off Kyle, "is under the protection of the Vipers Motorcycle Club. That means they're my family. You understand?" Kyle gave a jerky nod, unable to speak. "So," Rick continued, leaning in slightly, "if a single piece of trash finds its way onto their lawn, if their tires mysteriously go flat, if their house gets so much as a dirty look, I'm going to take it personally. And if you, or any of your little friends, ever so much as breathe in the direction of my niece again, what happens next won't be kids being kids. It'll be adults being adults. Do we have an understanding?" The threat hung in the air, unspoken but crystal clear. Kyle nodded again, more vigorously this time, looking like he was about to be sick. "Good," Rick said, straightening up. "Now apologize." Kyle's head shot up in surprise. "What?" Rick's expression didn't change. "You heard me. You're going to walk over to that front door, you're going to knock, and you are going to apologize to my brother, his wife, and most importantly, his daughter, for your behavior." He then turned his gaze back to Henderson. "And you are going to go to every house on this block and explain to them that there's been a misunderstanding. You're going to tell them that your new neighbors are good people and that they are to be welcomed and treated with respect. Because if I have to come back here, we're not going to be having a conversation." It was the most surreal thing I'd ever witnessed. From my living room window, I watched as Kyle, prodded by his father, stumbled across the lawn towards our front door. Sarah and I looked at each other, stunned. A moment later, our doorbell rang. I opened it to find Kyle Henderson on my porch, his face blotchy, his eyes red. His father stood a few feet behind him on the walkway, looking utterly defeated. Kyle couldn't look me in the eye. I'm sorry," he mumbled at his shoes. For everything." Sarah brought Lily to the door. I knelt down beside her. "Lily, this boy has something to say to you." Kyle finally looked up, his eyes meeting my daughter's. He saw not just a target, but a little girl he had terrified. "I'm sorry I scared you," he whispered, his voice cracking. Lily, in her infinite childish grace, just nodded shyly and hid behind my leg. For the rest of the afternoon, the Vipers just stayed. They didn't make a sound. They didn't drink or cause a scene. They just sat on their bikes, a silent, intimidating vigil. Some polished chrome, others just stared straight ahead. Their presence was a statement, a message to the whole neighborhood. We saw Henderson do exactly as Rick had told him, going from door to door, having hushed, frantic conversations on his neighbors' porches. The curtains on every house on the street twitched. We had gone from invisible pariahs to the most talked-about family in town in the span of an hour. As dusk began to settle, Rick walked back over to my house. He finally came inside. He knelt down and looked Lily in the eye. "No one's ever going to bother you again, kiddo," he said softly, a warmth in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. He stood up and looked at me. "They won't be a problem anymore," he said. And I believed him. He gave me a rough pat on the shoulder, turned, and walked out. A few minutes later, one by one, the engines roared back to life, and the Vipers rode off into the sunset, leaving behind a silence that felt different than before. It wasn't empty anymore. It felt peaceful. We thought that was the end of it. We thought we'd won. The next week was like living in a different neighborhood. People who had avoided our gaze now waved and smiled. Kyle and his friends would cross the street to avoid walking past our house. Henderson stayed inside. It was a victory, bought and paid for by a threat of violence I still felt uneasy about, but a victory nonetheless. We were safe. Then on Friday night, a week after the Vipers' visit, I was taking the trash out when I noticed a car I didn't recognize parked at the far end of the street, under a burned-out streetlight. It was a beat-up sedan with tinted windows. It was just sitting there, its engine off. A prickle of unease ran down my spine. I watched it for a few minutes, but nothing happened. I told myself I was being paranoid. I went back inside. An hour later, I looked out the window again. The car was still there, and this time a second one, a dark-colored pickup truck, was parked behind it. They weren't neighbors, they weren't visitors, they were watching us. And as I stared into the darkness, I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach that this wasn't Henderson. This wasn't a bunch of scared teenagers. We hadn't solved the problem. We had just kicked a much bigger, much more dangerous hornet's nest. My blood ran cold. This felt different. Henderson and his kid were neighborhood bullies, cowardly and loud. This was quiet, patient, and methodical. I called Rick immediately. "The cars are back," I said, skipping any greeting. "2 of them. Parked down the street. They're just watching the house." Rick's voice was grim. "Don't go outside. Lock your doors. I'm sending a couple of guys over. They'll sit outside your place all night. Do not engage with those cars, Mark. You hear me?" I heard him, but the thought of turning my quiet suburban home into a fortified compound with biker guards on the lawn made my stomach turn. This wasn't the life I wanted for my family. For 2 days, we lived under siege. 2 of Rick's guys, a quiet mountain of a man named Bear, and a wiry, watchful guy called Snake, parked their bikes on our driveway and just sat. They were respectful, refusing Sarah's offers of food and water, their eyes constantly scanning the street, The mysterious cars remained at a distance, a silent, ominous presence. The neighborhood held its breath. Our newfound peace was shattered, replaced by an even more terrifying tension. This wasn't just about a racist neighbor anymore. Henderson had clearly reached out to someone else, someone organized. We saw flyers in our mailbox again, but these were different. They weren't cheap photocopies. They were professionally printed pamphlets for a well-known, highly organized white nationalist group with a reputation for violence. Rick had scared off the dog, but in its place the owner had shown up, and he had a much bigger bite. The breaking point came on Sunday morning. I was watching the security camera feed when I saw a third car pull up and park with the other two. 4 men got out. They weren't teenagers. These were grown men, hard-faced and determined, dressed in jeans and bomber jackets. They started walking up the street, not towards my house, but towards Bear and Snake. My heart hammered against my ribs. I picked up the phone to call Rick, but it was already too late. I saw Snake say something into a small radio clipped to his vest. He and Bear stood up, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder in the middle of my driveway, a 2-man wall between the approaching men and my front door. I expected a fight. I expected shouting, maybe worse. But it didn't happen. The leader of the group, a tall man with a shaved head and a tattoo of a hateful symbol on his neck, stopped about 20 feet away from them. He didn't look at my house. He looked directly at Bear and Snake. He said something I couldn't hear. Bear just shook his head. The man gestured down the street as if presenting his forces. Bear folded his massive arms across his chest. The standoff lasted for 5 agonizing minutes. Then the sound started again. That low, distant rumble. But this time, it wasn't coming from one direction. It was coming from everywhere. From the east end of the street, a wave of motorcycles appeared, their headlights cutting through the morning haze. At the same time, from the west, another group roared into view. Within seconds, our block was flooded. But it wasn't just the Vipers this time. I saw different patches on their vests, the Iron Lords, the Sons of Redemption, the Highway Disciples. There were at least 100 of them, a multi-club army, a rolling tide of leather and chrome, engines thundering in a unified symphony of defiance. They didn't park haphazardly. They formed a perfect, impenetrable perimeter around our entire block, cutting off all exits. Rick was at the front, his Harley idling with a low growl. He dismounted and walked to the center of the street, stopping beside Bear and Snake. He faced the man with the neck tattoo. The 4 men, who had looked so intimidating just minutes before, now seemed small and hopelessly outnumbered. "You seem to be lost," Rick said, his voice amplified by the sudden expectant silence as 100 engines were cut. "This is our town. And this," he said, gesturing to my house, "is our family." The tattooed man's face was a mask of disbelief and fury. He had come expecting to intimidate one family and a couple of bikers. He had not expected to find himself facing the united front of every motorcycle club in the state. He looked at the endless sea of grim-faced men surrounding him. He looked at Rick. His jaw worked for a moment, but no words came out. He had lost, and he knew it. Without another word, he and his men turned, walked back to their cars, and drove away. They didn't look back. The bikers stayed for another hour, a silent, powerful show of force. Then, as quietly as they had arrived, they dispersed, melting back into the city. Rick came to the door one last time. "It's over," he said. "They won't be back. Their kind relies on fear and isolation. They just found out this family isn't isolated." He looked past me at Sarah and Lily, who were standing in the hallway. "You ever need anything," he said, his gaze softening, "you call me. That's what family is for." I finally found my voice. "Thank you, Rick. For everything." He just nodded, a small smile touching his lips for the first time. "No problem, little brother." That day something fundamental shifted in our neighborhood. The fear was gone, replaced by something else. Respect. Not just for us, but for the unlikely guardians who had stood up for us. That afternoon, our other next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a sweet old lady who had been polite but distant, came over with a freshly baked apple pie. "I'm so sorry we didn't do more," she said, her eyes filled with genuine regret. "We were scared. But what your family did, it was brave." One by one, others followed. We were no longer the outsiders. We were the family that 100 bikers had called their own. We never saw Henderson again. A for sale sign appeared on his lawn a week later. We had found our forever home, not just in the house with the oak tree, but in the community we had fought to be a part of, and in the family I thought I had lost. We had faced down hatred, not with more hate, but with an unshakable wall of unity, proving that sometimes the most powerful family isn't just the one you're born into, but the one that shows up when you need them most.